Rachel's heart raced as the taxi slowed to a halt in front of the small suburban house. After 5 long months away, working overseas, she had returned unannounced, eager to see her daughter Lisa and her husband Robert. She had spent weeks meticulously planning the surprise, imagining the joy on their faces when they saw her standing at the door. In her mind, everything would be perfect. Lisa safe, happy, and Robert, the steady anchor, keeping everything in check while she had been away. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden light across the front yard. Rachel felt a flutter of excitement as she stepped out of the car. She stood for a moment, steadying her breath. She had rehearsed this moment countless times on the plane ride home. But as she pushed open the front door, her smile froze when she saw Lisa sitting on the worn couch, her face pale and expressionless. Rachel's eyes immediately dropped to her daughter's midsection, and her heart nearly stopped. A swollen belly stretched against Lisa's shirt, a sight so jarring that Rachel felt like the ground had opened beneath her. For a split second she couldn't move, couldn't think. The joy she had anticipated evaporated, leaving only confusion and dread. "What?" Rachel's voice cracked, the question hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Her mind raced, refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. Her pulse thudded loudly in her ears. "Lisa, what is this?" Lisa, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and shame, looked to Robert, who stood awkwardly by the door, his face drained of color. He stepped forward, his hands out in a placating gesture. But before he could speak, Rachel turned on him, her voice a sharp blade cutting through the tension. "What did you do?" Her voice was low, but each word was laced with a mother's unrelenting fury. "How could you let this happen? How dare you?" Robert flinched, holding his hands up in defense, his eyes darting between Rachel and Lisa. "Rachel, wait, listen. It's not what you think, I swear. Nothing happened, Nothing happened," her voice rising, fueled by disbelief and anger. Her gaze burned into him, daring him to explain away the evidence right before her eyes. "Look at her. She's a child, Robert." Her voice cracked with the weight of those words, and tears of rage threatened to spill over. "You were supposed to protect her." Robert took a step back, visibly shaken. "Rachel, please, just listen for a second. I don't know how it happened, but I didn't." His words faltered under her gaze. He looked helpless, desperate, but his protests fell on deaf ears. Rachel's mind reeled. It felt as though the walls were closing in on her. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Her eyes flicked back to Lisa, who had yet to say a word. Her daughter's face was drained of all color, her hands nervously picking at the fabric of the couch. "Lisa, talk to me," Rachel demanded, her voice trembling now with a desperate plea. "What is going on?" Lisa shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes, but her lips remained sealed, as though glued shut by the weight of the situation. Rachel's frustration mounted, her thoughts spiraling. She couldn't afford to stay calm any longer. "I'm calling the police," Rachel muttered through gritted teeth, already pulling her phone from her bag. "I'll have them deal with this. You're done, Robert." "No, Rachel, wait!" Robert reached out, but Rachel shot him a look so venomous that he stopped mid-step. "You don't understand, please. Give me a chance to explain." Rachel dialed the number, her hands shaking so badly that she nearly dropped the phone. She could barely register Robert's frantic attempts to speak. Lisa sobbed quietly from the couch, her body trembling under the weight of the unspoken words. Rachel felt her heart splinter, torn between the need to protect her daughter and the fear that she had already failed her. The moment the dispatcher's voice came through the line, Rachel's voice hardened with resolve. "I need to report a crime," she said. her eyes never leaving Robert's pale, horrified face. "My daughter, she's been—" The words stuck in her throat, but Rachel forced them out. "She's pregnant, and it's his fault." The weight of her accusation hung in the air as Robert stood, frozen, in shock, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that wouldn't come. But it didn't matter anymore. Rachel knew there was no going back. She grabbed Lisa's hand and pulled her up from the couch. Without another word, they left the house, Rachel's mind a storm of fury, guilt, and fear, leaving Robert behind to face the consequences of what she believed to be his unforgivable betrayal. Several months ago, Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the letter of offer from Paris lay open beside her, its words both a promise and a burden. Robert, still groggy from sleep, shifted beside her, sensing the tension in the air. Rachel looks out the window of the new house, staring out at the rows of neatly trimmed lawns and picket fences, her thoughts drifting far from the picturesque scene in front of her. This was supposed to be the start of a perfect life. She had finally found Robert, a man she could trust after so many years of doing everything on her own. And now, after 3 years of steady companionship, they had tied the knot. Her 12-year-old daughter Lisa had moved in with them, and together they bought this house, a symbol of their commitment and their future. They had taken out a significant loan to afford the place, stretching their finances to the limit. Every month, the mortgage loomed over them like a storm cloud. Robert had reassured her countless times that they would manage. "We'll figure it out, Rachel. Don't worry," he'd say, his voice calm and steady, the way it always was. Yet the weight of that responsibility gnawed at her. The thought of losing the house, of letting her family down, terrified her more than she wanted to admit. "You've barely slept." Robert's voice startled Rachel back to reality. Robert seemed to read Rachel's mind, and he gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "I know, but 6 months is a long time, Rach. For you, for me, for Lisa, you'll be half a world away from us." The mention of her daughter's name brought a fresh wave of anxiety. Rachel's chest tightened. "I know it is," she whispered, eyes downcast. "But this job, it's everything I've worked for. The salary, the experience, it could change everything for us. We could finally breathe." Robert's hand slid from her shoulder, his fingers intertwining with hers. He didn't speak, but the silence between them was heavy with unspoken worries. Lisa's face flickered in Rachel's mind, her wide, questioning eyes, the way she clung to her whenever she left the house for even a short while. How could she explain leaving for 6 months to a 12-year-old who still needed her so desperately? "I don't want her to feel abandoned," Rachel said, her voice breaking. "I promised her after the wedding that things would get easier, that we'd be a family now." Robert squeezed her hand, his grip firm but steady. "She won't feel abandoned, Rachel. I'll be here. I'll take care of her. You know that." Rachel glanced sideways at him. His face was calm, but she could see the lines of worry etched across his forehead. He was a good man, kind, patient, but she knew this wasn't what he had signed up for when they married. Stepping in as a father figure to a preteen girl wasn't easy, especially when he'd never had children of his own. "And what if it's too much?" Rachel asked, almost as if testing him. "What if Lisa resents you? Or worse, what if she shuts down completely?" Robert smiled faintly, a trace of humor lighting his eyes. "She's 12, Rachel. She already resents me half the time." He leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "We'll get through this. You're not leaving forever, and you'll call every day if you need to." Rachel closed her eyes, leaning into him, but her mind was already racing ahead. But would Lisa understand? Could she understand? Later that afternoon, the house was filled with the subdued sounds of packing. Lisa sat at the kitchen table, silently watching her mother fold clothes into a suitcase, her usually chatty demeanor muted. Rachel could feel her daughter's eyes on her, but she avoided meeting her gaze for fear of breaking down. "Hey, sweetheart," Robert said, entering the room with a soft smile. "I was thinking, after your mom leaves, we can go out to that ice cream place you like. What do you say?" Lisa looked up at him, her face emotionless, then shrugged. "Sure," she muttered, her attention quickly returning to the table. Rachel paused, her heart sinking. She knelt beside Lisa, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I know this is hard, honey," she said softly, "but it's not forever. 6 months will fly by, and Robert's going to take such good care of you." Lisa didn't respond immediately. She just stared down at the wooden table, tracing invisible patterns with her fingers. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What if something happens while you're gone?" Rachel's throat tightened. "Nothing will happen, sweetheart. I'll be back before you know it, and we'll be together again. I promise." Lisa's eyes flicked toward Robert, who was standing quietly by the doorway. There was a moment of silence before she finally nodded, though Rachel could see the doubt lingering in her daughter's expression. The time for goodbyes came too soon. Standing outside with the taxi waiting at the curb, Rachel hugged Lisa tightly, feeling her daughter's small body trembling against hers. Robert stood by, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his eyes on the ground. "I love you so much," Rachel whispered into Lisa's hair. "I'll miss you every single day." "I'll miss you too, Mum," Lisa replied, her voice breaking slightly as she pulled back, wiping at her eyes. The apartment was quieter than Lisa had ever imagined. The hum of the city outside, a distant murmur, only made the silence inside more oppressive. It had been just a month since her mother left, but each day felt like a long, drawn-out struggle. The coldness of the unfamiliar surroundings seeped into her bones, leaving her feeling out of place, despite Robert's efforts to make the new environment seem welcoming. "How about pizza for dinner tonight?" Robert asked one evening, his voice warm but laced with uncertainty. He stood in the doorway of Lisa's room, watching her as she sat by the window, staring out at the rooftops below. Lisa shrugged, barely lifting her eyes from the view. "I'm not really hungry," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. The loneliness that hung over her seemed to deepen with each passing day, especially without her mother, Rachel. The nightly video calls with Rachel were once Lisa's only solace. In those early days, her eyes would light up whenever the screen flickered to life, and Rachel's familiar voice filled the room. The next few calls became shorter, with Lisa often giving little more than monosyllabic responses. She no longer shared stories from her day or asked about her mother's life abroad. It was as if a wall had risen between them, slowly but steadily. Rachel could sense something was off, but every time she tried to probe deeper, Lisa would claim she was just tired, or that school was overwhelming. Robert, too, always reassured her that everything was fine, that Lisa just needed time to adjust. But Rachel knew her daughter better than that. Lisa had always been expressive, her emotions worn openly on her sleeve. The sudden quietness, the lack of energy, it all pointed to something much deeper than mere exhaustion. As the weeks passed, the calls with Rachel became less frequent. Robert started making excuses for Lisa. "She's exhausted," he'd say with a casual shrug. "She's been working hard at school, playing with new friends. She'll call you tomorrow." Rachel, though hesitant, accepted his reassurances at first. After all, Lisa was growing up, wasn't she? It was natural for kids to need space. But something gnawed at Rachel. The way Robert's voice seemed too even, too smooth. The way Lisa looked so disconnected during their last few calls. Was it just the strain of the distance? Or was something deeper lurking beneath the surface? Rachel began to feel the weight of doubt settling in. She knew Robert was a good man. He'd always been reliable, patient, understanding. But now, thousands of miles away, with only a screen between her and her daughter, that trust began to waver. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was an undercurrent in Robert's tone, a slight hesitation in his updates about Lisa. One evening, after yet another missed call, Rachel sat staring at her phone, her heart heavy. She tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination, that her anxieties were unfounded. But each time she replayed Robert's words in her mind, that knot of uncertainty tightened. Was Lisa really just tired? Or was something happening in that apartment? Something that Robert didn't want her to know? Rachel's hands trembled as she texted Robert, asking for a call with Lisa the next evening. She knew she couldn't shake this feeling until she heard her daughter's voice again. The distance between them felt more vast than ever, and as the hours passed, Rachel's unease grew into a quiet terror. The doctor's footsteps startled Rachel back to reality. The air in the hospital room felt stifling, despite the sterile coolness. Rachel sat rigidly by the window, staring at nothing in particular, her thoughts swirling like a storm she couldn't control. The doctor said a diagnosis she never expected to hear. Lisa was 4 months pregnant. Her heart thudded loudly in her chest, echoing with confusion and betrayal. 4 months. How did I not see this coming? She wondered. The pieces didn't fit. Her daughter was only 12-year-old, a child in so many ways. The thought of someone violating that innocence made her stomach churn. Rachel turned towards Lisa, who sat silently on the examination table, her face pale, hands nervously clutching at the fabric of her jeans. She hadn't said much since the test results came back. Lisa's eyes, normally so full of life, were downcast, avoiding her mother's gaze. "Lisa," Rachel began, her voice low and measured, "we need to talk about what's happened." Lisa blinked, but said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor. The silence was oppressive. Rachel felt a knot forming in her chest. Was Lisa ashamed? Or was it something worse? Rachel knew she needed to approach this carefully. She couldn't bear the thought of her daughter retreating further into herself. She sat down next to Lisa, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, I just need to know what's been going on. I'm not here to blame anyone, I just want to help." Still, Lisa didn't speak. She stared ahead, emotionless, like the truth was a boulder she could not lift. Rachel felt her patience thinning, but she tamped down the frustration. There was something unsaid here, something crucial. Her mind shifted to Robert, her husband. He had been caring for Lisa while she worked late, trusting him to watch over her daughter. But the thought gnawed at her. Could he have hurt her? The idea alone made her stomach twist in knots. What if he threatened her? What if that's why she's not saying anything? Rachel's throat felt dry. She couldn't ask Lisa directly, at least not yet. Instead, she decided to probe more subtly. "So, how's everything been at home?" Rachel asked, her voice gentle, though her insides tensed with anticipation. "What have you and Robert been up to while I've been at work?" Lisa shrugged. "Nothing much," she said flatly. "Just watching TV, doing homework. He makes dinner sometimes." Her answers were hollow, rehearsed. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. Did Did anything ever make you feel uncomfortable? Did he say or do anything you didn't like? Lisa's eyes flickered with confusion, and for a brief moment Rachel thought she saw fear. But just as quickly, it vanished. No, Mom, it's nothing like that. Rachel wanted to believe her, but the hollow feeling in her gut told her otherwise. Maybe she's just too afraid to speak up, Rachel thought, biting her lip as her mind raced. Maybe he's threatened her, scared her into silence. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She spent hours going over every detail of the last few years, the nights she'd come home late, the quiet tension in Lisa's eyes whenever Robert entered the room. Was I blind? Was I ignoring the signs? A few days later, while cleaning Lisa's room, Rachel stumbled across a small, folded note stuffed under her daughter's mattress. The handwriting was familiar, Lisa's unmistakable scrawl, but the words on the page made Rachel's stomach drop. It was a letter, addressed to a boy named Luke. A flurry of other notes followed, hidden beneath her daughter's clothes. The letters were innocent enough at first, talk of school and jokes. But then came the mentions of affection, the secret moments shared between them, the kisses, the closeness. Rachel's hands trembled as she read them. Could this be it? Could Luke be the father? Her mind flooded with questions, but also a fierce, protective rage. She needed answers, and fast. The next morning, Rachel stormed into Lisa's school. She demanded a meeting with Luke's parents, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. When they arrived, she wasted no time. "I found letters between your son and my daughter," Rachel said sharply, fixing them with a hard stare. "There's something going on between them. I need to know if Luke has been involved." Luke's mother looked taken aback but responded calmly. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Luke hasn't been in town for 6 months. We moved him to New York for a better school. They've only been in contact through letters since then. He hasn't seen Lisa for months." The room spun for Rachel as she processed this information. So if Luke wasn't here, then who? She clenched her fists, the certainty she had clung to now slipping through her fingers. Nothing made sense anymore. What else was Lisa hiding? And why? The hospital room was cold, too bright under the sterile white lights. Rachel sat in a stiff plastic chair by the window, her hands gripping the armrests, knuckles white. The sounds of beeping machines, footsteps echoing in the hall, and the occasional murmur of nurses filled the background. Lisa lay on the bed, her small figure dwarfed by the sterile sheets. The doctors had been in and out for hours, each time with more questions than answers. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, not just with her daughter's condition, but with the entire situation. The bruises on Lisa's arms and legs disturbed her. They seemed out of place. Rachel had noticed them a few days earlier, but assumed they were normal childhood injuries. Lisa often played outside, occasionally roughhousing with friends. Now, those dark splotches felt ominous, as if they hinted at something far more sinister. The door creaked open, and Dr. Stevens entered, holding a clipboard. His face, usually calm and composed, bore a trace of unease. Rachel's heart sank further. She straightened in her chair, bracing for whatever was coming. "We've completed the tests," Dr. Stevens said, his voice steady but low. He glanced at Lisa, still asleep under sedation, before turning his full attention to Rachel. "There are some unusual results." Rachel's stomach churned. She felt the urge to scream, to demand answers, but her throat was too tight to speak. Instead, she nodded, her eyes locked on the doctor. "We couldn't find any signs of sexual assault," he began, easing into the explanation, but Rachel barely exhaled in relief before he continued. "And Lisa isn't pregnant." The words hung in the air like a punch. Rachel's mind went blank, then rushed into overdrive. "Not pregnant?" She stared at him, waiting for further explanation, unable to form the question burning in her chest. "It's called pseudocyesis," Dr. Stevens explained, sitting down across from her. "It's a rare condition, a psychological pregnancy. Her body manifested all the signs of pregnancy, including hormone changes, but there's no fetus. It's typically brought on by severe emotional distress." Rachel blinked, processing his words slowly. Lisa wasn't pregnant. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly swallowed by confusion. How could her daughter have gone through this? What had caused her to suffer so much, to the point her own body betrayed her? She felt the weight of guilt settle like a boulder in her chest. What had she missed? How had she not seen it? I don't understand," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "How could this happen?" Dr. Stevens sighed, his expression softening. "It's difficult to pinpoint the exact cause, but given the circumstances, your recent separation, Lisa's sudden adjustment to living with Robert, it's possible that the stress of these changes affected her more than anyone realized. Children don't always express their emotions in obvious ways." Dr. Stevens interrupted her thoughts. "Lisa will need therapy, counseling to help her process whatever she's been going through. It's important for her to feel safe, and that starts with understanding the root of her anxiety." Rachel nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere. She felt a sudden rush of anger. Robert had been the one with Lisa all those months. He had reassured her and told her everything was fine. How could he not have seen this coming? The police had taken Robert that morning. Accusations were flying around their small town. The whole situation felt like it had spiraled beyond her control, and now Robert was facing charges for something the doctors had just disproved. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that he was keeping something from her, something he hadn't told her about those 5 long months. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on Lisa's peaceful face. No matter what the doctors said, no matter how much guilt tugged at her heart, she needed to know the truth, and she was going to get it, even if it shattered the fragile reality she was trying to hold on to. The small room was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock mounted on the wall. Rachel sat across from Dr. Miller, the child psychologist, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her purse. Lisa sat next to her, hunched over, her shoulders drawn in as if she wanted to disappear into the chair. Rachel stole a glance at her daughter, noticing how small and fragile she looked, how different she seemed from the vibrant child she once knew. Guilt gnawed at Rachel's insides. "It's okay, Lisa." Dr. Miller's voice was calm, soothing. She smiled gently at the girl sitting across from her in the cozy office. "We're just going to talk today. You don't have to say anything you don't want to." Lisa fidgeted, her fingers picking at the frayed edge of her sleeve, eyes locked on the floor. Rachel felt a pang in her chest. This was her fault. Her decisions, her mistakes had led to this. She had been so focused on her job, on securing a future for both of them, that she hadn't realized what it was costing Lisa. "I know it's hard," Rachel said softly, leaning in a little closer to her daughter. "But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Lisa didn't respond at first. The silence stretched, thick with tension, until finally her voice, barely above a whisper, broke through the quiet. "The kids at school don't like me. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, and Dr. Miller gently encouraged, "Can you tell us more about that, Lisa?" The girl shifted uncomfortably, her small hands twisting together. "They make fun of me. They say I'm weird. I don't have any friends anymore." Her voice wavered, and she quickly wiped her eyes, trying to hold back tears. "And Robert. He's always busy. He forgets to pick me up after school. I don't like waiting alone." Rachel felt her heart clench. She had known things were hard, but hearing it from Lisa's lips, the way her words trembled with hurt, made it all the more real. "Lisa, I didn't know—" Her voice cracked, and she took a deep breath, fighting back her own emotions. "I'm so sorry." Dr. Miller sat back slightly, nodding. "Lisa, what you're feeling is very real, and it's important for us to understand what's been happening. When there's a big change in someone's life, like your mum leaving for work or moving in with Robert, it can make you feel upset, even if you don't realize it at first." Lisa remained silent, her face downcast, but Rachel could see the truth in the doctor's words. The separation, the changes, the months without her, it had all been too much for a little girl to carry. No wonder Lisa had retreated into herself, away from her friends, away from school. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Lisa," Rachel said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now. I see now how much I hurt you." Dr. Miller glanced between them, her tone soft but firm. "The stress from everything, feeling lonely, disconnected from your friends, and the changes at home, it's likely what led to Lisa's condition. The body can respond in strange ways when it's under emotional stress, especially in children." Rachel nodded, though it felt like a hollow gesture. She understood, logically, what the doctor was saying, but it didn't ease the guilt twisting in her gut. She had failed Lisa. She had frantically blamed. Then, after the therapy session, Rachel went to the police station and explained everything and withdrew the charges against Robert. "I'm sorry," Rachel whispered, "for accusing you, for everything." Robert glanced at her, his eyes weary, but he didn't respond right away. He let out a long sigh and finally said, "I get it. You were scared. But it still hurts, Rachel. You didn't trust me." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, nodding. "I know. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. I was so caught up in my own fear that I didn't stop to think." She paused, feeling the weight of her next words. "I don't know how we fix this." Robert let the silence hang for a moment before speaking again, his voice low and resigned. "Maybe we can't. At least not right now. I think we need some time apart, Rachel." The words hit her like a punch, even though she'd expected them. She nodded, slowly, tears burning in the corners of her eyes. "Maybe you're right." They sat in silence, neither of them moving, the weight of their decisions pressing down on them. It wasn't anger anymore, but a quiet understanding that something between them had broken, and neither of them was sure if it could ever be repaired. Several weeks later, Lisa began attending therapy sessions. The therapist's office was quiet, filled only with the soft ticking of a clock on the far wall. Lisa sat curled in a chair, her hands tucked under her legs, eyes fixed on the floor. The past few weeks had been an emotional blur for her. Between the hospital visits, the confusion, and the endless questions, she barely knew how to feel anymore. But now, in this small, dimly lit room, she was supposed to start putting the pieces back together. Across from her, Rachel sat stiffly, trying to find comfort in the unfamiliar surroundings. The past months had been harder than she could have ever imagined. Watching Lisa suffer had broken something inside of her, and now the guilt wouldn't let her breathe. She had left her daughter. Her throat tightened every time she thought about it, but she was determined to be there for Lisa now. She wouldn't make the same mistake again. Lisa's therapist, a soft-spoken woman with warm eyes, sat on the edge of her chair, waiting for Lisa to speak. It was still early, and the sessions had just begun, but there was a sense that they were standing at the edge of something vast and unknown. This was the start of Lisa's recovery, a journey that would take time, patience, and more strength than Rachel ever thought she had. "Whenever you're ready, Lisa," the therapist gently encouraged. Lisa didn't respond immediately, biting her lip as she stared at the grey carpet. It was hard for her to put into words what had happened. Nothing made sense anymore. How could her body have betrayed her like that? She felt broken, like something was wrong with her, like it was her fault. Every time she thought about the pregnancy that never was, her chest tightened and her throat went dry. I don't know what happened," Lisa finally whispered, her voice trembling. Everything was fine, and then it wasn't. Rachel's heart shattered all over again. She reached over, taking Lisa's hand in hers, squeezing it gently. "We're going to figure it out, sweetheart. We're going to get through this." Lisa nodded. Through her eyes, remained downcast. The weight of the last few months sat heavily on both of them, but Rachel was determined to hold them together. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Healing never was. But they would do it, one step at a time. And this time, she would be there every step of the way. Meanwhile, Robert stood outside, leaning against the car, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. The air was crisp, carrying the first hints of winter, but the chill didn't bother him. His mind was too full. He had been cleared, yes, but the relief he had expected never came. Instead, there was just this overwhelming emptiness. The accusation had shaken him more than he could admit. The looks from the neighbors, the whispers behind his back, the disbelief in Rachel's eyes when she first saw Lisa that day, it all lingered in his head like a dark cloud. No matter how many times Rachel had apologized, no matter how much she assured him she didn't really believe he'd done something so monstrous, the doubt had been there. And now Robert wasn't sure what to do with that knowledge. Could he and Rachel ever truly move past this? He wanted to believe they could, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed forever. He loved Rachel, loved Lisa, like she was his own, but the question gnawed at him. Was love enough? Was it strong enough to heal the cracks that had formed between them? Inside, Rachel felt the same doubts gnawing at her. She had failed Lisa. She had failed Robert, and she had failed herself. But she was trying to rebuild, to piece together the parts of her life that had shattered in the wake of this disaster. She had made a vow to herself that she would never let her career or her ambitions come between her and her daughter again. The distance had caused this, hadn't it? If she had been there, maybe she would have seen the signs. Maybe she could have prevented it. She couldn't change the past, but she could do better now. And she would. Robert, too, knew he had his own role to play. He had tried to step in for Rachel, to be the father figure Lisa needed. But maybe he hadn't been enough. Maybe he had missed something, too. Becoming a father, or trying to be one, wasn't as simple as he thought. There were responsibilities, burdens he hadn't anticipated, and he couldn't just brush it off anymore. He had a part in Lisa's healing too, and it was time he faced that. The door to the therapist's office opened, and Lisa stepped out, followed by Rachel. Their eyes met, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope. however fragile it might be. Robert straightened up, his gaze softening as he watched them approach. Maybe love wasn't perfect. Maybe it wasn't enough on its own, but together they would try to make it work. Together they would heal. The days had a different rhythm now, quieter but still heavy with the echoes of what had happened. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her eyes tracing the lines of sunlight that streamed in through the window. Outside, the leaves rustled softly, a sign that autumn was settling in. She sipped her coffee slowly, feeling the warmth but still unable to shake the lingering cold in her chest. It had been months since that fateful day at the hospital, months since the truth came out about Lisa's condition. The shock had given way to relief, but the relief didn't come without scars. The accusations, the misunderstandings, the confusion, they had left their mark. But time, as everyone always said, was a healer, even if it moved slower than you'd like. Rachel glanced across the table at Robert. He was reading the newspaper, his brow furrowed in concentration. They hadn't talked about that day much since he'd come home. There were still things left unsaid, still wounds that needed tending. But they had both agreed to move forward, to rebuild what had been nearly lost. Slowly, almost tentatively, they had begun to open up to one another again. It wasn't perfect. It might never be. But it was a start. "Coffee still good?" Robert asked, looking up from his paper with a small smile. His voice, once so familiar, now felt like a gentle reminder that they were both trying. Rachel nodded, her own smile faint but genuine. "Yeah, it's good." She paused, letting the silence between them settle in a way that no longer felt awkward. "How's the article?" Same old, he shrugged, folding the paper and setting it aside. He looked at her, and for a moment she saw the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, the man who had stood by her through so much, even when things had gotten messy. But enough about that. How's Lisa doing? Rachel's eyes softened at the mention of her daughter. Lisa had been through the worst of it, but she was getting better, little by little. "She's doing okay," Rachel said, her voice soft. "She's with a therapist now, and they've been working through everything." There was a beat of silence before she added, "She seems happier, though. I think it's helping." Robert nodded, his gaze drifting toward the hallway where Lisa's room was. "I'm glad. She deserves to feel like a kid again." The weight of his words hung in the air for a moment, and Rachel knew he meant more than just Lisa. In some ways, they all deserved to move on, to find happiness again after everything had come crashing down around them. But the process was slow. Trust took time to rebuild. And even though she had forgiven Robert, she wasn't sure if either of them would ever truly forget. Lisa's laughter suddenly broke the quiet, a bright sound that drifted in from the other room. Rachel's heart lifted at the sound. It had been so long since she'd heard her daughter laugh like that, so carefree and genuine. "She's with her friends," Rachel explained, smiling. "They've been coming over more often, playing video games, doing normal kid stuff. I think it's helping her move on." Robert smiled too, the tension in his face easing a bit. That's good. Really good. It wasn't just Lisa who was learning to live again. Rachel had noticed how Robert was slowly finding his way back to the man he used to be, patient, loving and hopeful. He had taken up small projects around the house, like fixing the porch or painting the fence, simple acts that spoke of his commitment to staying, to healing with them. The three of them had begun to find a rhythm again. Meals together, small talks at the dinner table, laughter during movie nights. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than Rachel had hoped for when everything had fallen apart. They were healing together. "I think," Rachel said quietly, breaking the moment of peace, "we're going to be okay." Robert looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah," he agreed. "I think we are." There were still challenges ahead. There always would be. Life was messy, unpredictable, full of twists you never saw coming. But now they faced it with a deeper understanding of one another. Love wasn't always enough to fix everything, but love and forgiveness, they could carry you through the worst of it. Lisa bounded into the room, her energy infectious. "Mom! Robert! Can we have pizza for dinner?" Rachel smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in months. "Sure, honey," she said, her voice full of a softness that spoke of hope. Robert caught her eye, and for the first time in a long while, they shared a look that wasn't burdened by doubt or fear, just love. As Lisa chattered on about her day, Rachel allowed herself to breathe. The storm had passed. They were still standing. And for now, that was enough. The early morning sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns across the nursery walls. Rachel stood by the crib, rocking gently on her heels as she looked down at the tiny figure wrapped snugly in a pastel blue blanket. The room was still, the peaceful quiet only broken by the baby's soft breathing. Her heart swelled, a mixture of joy and disbelief washing over her. It had been a long journey to get here, one filled with more pain and uncertainty than she had ever imagined. But now, as she gazed at the baby, his little fingers curled around nothing in particular, she felt whole for the first time in years. Behind her, Robert walked in, barefoot and careful not to disturb the quiet moment. His eyes softened when they met hers. "How's he doing?" he asked in a hushed voice, leaning over to take a peek at their newborn. "Perfect," Rachel whispered, her lips curving into a smile. She reached up, absent-mindedly smoothing her hair behind her ear. "He's absolutely perfect." Robert wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. They stood there in silence for a while, just absorbing the reality of their new life. It felt surreal, like the storm had finally passed, and now they were standing in the calm after all the chaos. So family. The kind of family she had always dreamed about, but never thought she could actually have. "Can you believe it?" Robert murmured, his voice low and full of wonder. "After everything, we finally made it here." Rachel's throat tightened, a flood of memories surging forward. The uncertainty when they had almost lost each other. The fear when Lisa had gone through her terrifying ordeal. And the long nights of guilt and doubt that had haunted them both for so long. But through it all, they had held on to each other. And now, here they were, stronger, more united than ever before. "I can't," Rachel admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm so glad we did." The baby stirred, his little mouth opening in a soft yawn. Rachel chuckled, her heart so full it almost hurt. "He's going to be just like you," she teased, glancing at Robert with a playful glint in her eyes. "And I couldn't be more proud of the woman you're becoming." Lisa held on tight, the unspoken bond between them stronger than words could ever express. When they finally pulled away, Robert cleared his throat, his voice light but full of warmth. "All right, ladies, let's not leave the little man out." They all gathered around the crib, the baby now stirring more, his tiny face scrunching up as if sensing the presence of his family. Rachel's heart brimmed with contentment as she looked at them, her husband, her daughter, and her newborn son. This was everything she had ever wanted, a future full of love, strength, and family. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. Thank you for following this emotional story to the end. Through all the ups and downs, Rachel, Robert, and Lisa finally found happiness together, and we witnessed the birth of a new member of the family. It was great to see Lisa mature, strong, and ready to embrace her role as a big sister with all her love. If you feel touched or related to this story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on the upcoming inspiring stories. I look forward to hearing from you in the comments section. What do you think about Rachel and her family's journey, and what makes you feel most connected? Please click the notification bell to explore more memorable stories with me. Thank you, everyone, and see you in the next video.